Moving on to the panel on leveraging public finance to mainstream climate change, may I now invite Professor Romar Correa, former professor, University of Mumbai, to kindly come to the dais and chair this session. It gives me immense pleasure to invite the distinguished panel of speakers for this panel of lectures. Paul Steele, Chief Economist, IIED UK. Kenneth MacClune, ISET-International, Research into Action. Purnamita Dasgupta, Professor, IEG, New Delhi. Abinash Mohanty, Director, Center for Environment, Energy and Climate Change, ADRI. I request all the delegate speakers to kindly come to the dais. I'll now hand over the session to Professor Correa. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to be very, yeah, I got it. Good morning and welcome to this very welcome next session on climate change. Without question, across the hard and soft sciences, there can be nothing more important theory and policy than the theme of climate change. And from the literature that is already available, there is nothing thinner than the material on financing, both public and private, of climate change. So we are extremely grateful. I am thrilled to be chairing this session. And for the purpose, we have a very illustrious panel whose bios are with you. And I'm not going to, therefore, summarize them because we have a very hard time constraint in front of us, to which has been added a strict time constraint by the organizer of this conference. So without any ado, I am going to ask in order Paul Steele, Kenneth MacClune, Purnamita Dasgupta, and Abinash Mohanty to take, shall we say, 10 minutes each? Is that tough? 15? 15? Okay, 15, and maybe I'll give you a friendly, friendly wave at around 10, 12 minutes to ask you to begin to wind up, and then maybe we'll have to impose on the tea break after this. So Paul Steele. They're pretty strict about the time thing, so yeah, and we've sort of overshot in the previous.
Good morning, everybody. So I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers for inviting me here. I come from the International Institute for Environment and Development. It's a UK research institution which does work on climate change amongst other environment and development issues. The linkages between climate change and public finance is an emerging field. And I want to draw from my experience working across Asia Pacific. Before joining IIED, I worked for the UN with ministries of finance in different countries in Asia Pacific, looking at how they could integrate climate change into their public finance and budget processes. And I want to kick off by maybe bringing a slightly different perspective. We've heard from some of the health professionals here, a lot of skepticism about the role of the state in certain public policy problems and about challenges with the role of the state. But in the case of climate change, some of the prominent economists have called climate change the world's biggest market failure. So I think when you come to climate change, you really need to give the state an important role. And we'll be hearing about two different aspects of climate policy for those of you who are not so familiar. The first is climate mitigation, where you reduce the problems causing climate change and you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, primarily carbon dioxide emissions, which come from the energy sector and the transport sector, and to some extent are sequestered by forests. So that's known in the literature as climate mitigation. And then the second aspect of the problem is if you can't mitigate climate change, then you have to adapt. You have to adapt and increase your resilience to the climate problem. So you have to look at disaster management in a state like Bihar. I know you've suffered a lot from problems of floods and drought, which are increasingly linked to climate change. And you have to look at other ways that households in rural and urban areas can adapt to climate change. So I'm going to be looking at this issue of climate mitigation and climate adaptation and how it links to the budget process. So this is a summary of my presentation. First of all, I want to look at the broad, what I call climate finance ecosystem. That's the different aspects of climate finance and how they interrelate together. Then I want to look at the linkages with the budget process, and many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the budget process, but I just want to remind you where climate change comes in. And then I want to look at some detail at the budget approval, at the budget planning and preparation process and how you can look at integrating climate change. And then looking at the budget execution and budget oversight process, and then finally some conclusions. So in terms of the climate finance ecosystem, this is the different aspects of climate finance. And you'll see that while we have government expenditure at the top, I put in the larger letters in the middle, household and individual expenditure. And then we also have expenditures by the private sector, by firms and the corporate sector, and then by civil society and NGOs. And all these groups are spending money on mitigating and adapting to climate finance. But this diagram is trying to make 2 points in particular. First of all, it demonstrates how individual government, private sector and civil society expenditures all relate together and have to be seen together in order to address climate change. And secondly, that households or individual expenditures are the largest and probably the most effective expenditure particularly on climate adaptation. And I'm going to explain that in a bit more detail. So this is on this issue of what I've called household climate expenditures, where, as I've said, households are the largest and probably the most effective source of climate expenditures. And just to give some examples, farmers in a state like Bihar and other parts of India and other parts of the world are increasingly buying drought-resistant seeds or moving to cities to escape disaster-prone rural areas which are being affected by climate-related disasters. And within urban areas, urban shanty dwellers are continually rebuilding their homes and having to respond after climate-related floods. So you see that households are having to spend their own funds on responding to climate change. And what we need to remember is that national and international climate finance needs to support these household climate expenditures. So in the literature, you'll see there's been a lot of discussion about international finance. You may have heard of something called the Green Climate Fund. You may have heard of the debates about transferring finances from the rich countries to the poor countries. And you may have heard, there is some discussion about the role of the state. But what I'm trying to point to is that very little discussion has been done at the household and the individual level, who are the ones who are actually bearing the bulk of spending their own resources on climate finance. And that's where we need more research and more work at the moment. Turning now to the national level of the budget cycle, and this is just the standard budget cycle diagram. You see, starting with in the top right-hand quadrant, planning and budget preparation, then budget approval, then budget execution, and then budget oversight. And I'm going to go through each of these steps in the budget cycle and demonstrate how climate can be linked to them. And this is the key activities in a standard budget cycle. In the budget preparation, you have the 5-year plan, you have the annual and sector plans, you have the budget call circular coming from the Ministry of Finance or the Department of Finance, and then you have the capital investment program related to capital projects. Then within the budget approval process, you have the budget speech and the budget debate, and then within budget execution, you have disbursement, procurement, and operation and maintenance of different expenditures. And then in the oversight step, you have the audit process, including tracking of expenditures. So I'm going to go through each of these steps in the budget cycle and see how climate change can be integrated into them as a new area of priority public policy work. So in terms of, first of all, looking at planning and preparation, each department or ministry in the government or the state needs to look at how they can integrate climate indicators and climate actions into their budget framework. Secondly, they need to look at how the Ministry of Finance or the Department of Finance can integrate climate projects and prioritize them into the budget call circular. So when they send out a call for projects, these climate projects can be prioritized and called up by the line agencies. Then when it comes to capital projects, we need a way of climate risks, in particular related to adaptation, can be screened in the public investment plan, and each capital project can be investigated to see to what extent climate risks are being integrated. And then fourthly, the issue of tax policy, particularly on the mitigation side when we look at pricing of fossil fuels and pricing of energy and transport expenditures, how can tax policy be integrated and aligned with climate policy? Turning now to approval and execution and audit, when we come to the approval process, when the budget is presented to the legislature, some countries in Asia Pacific are developing...
Paul, you'll have to speed over the level of detail, all right?
Just this slide and one more.
All right.
2 more slides. So some countries have a climate budget which they're releasing, and I think Bihar has done that, and we'll be hearing from Abinash a bit more detail on that. And then the budget speech can pick up references to climate, and then committees can scrutinize the budget for how it's addressing climate risks. In terms of execution, you can look at procurement and operation and maintenance of climate investments to see how they're addressing climate risks. And then finally, on the audit side, you can look at how climate expenditures are being audited. And this is my final slide. So just to summarize in terms of conclusions, it's important to understand climate expenditures. It's important to link climate into all stages of the budget cycle. As I hope I've demonstrated, climate is much more than a responsibility of the Ministry of Finance, and there's a key role of the Ministry of Finance. It's much more than the responsibility of Ministry of Environment, and there's a key role of the Ministry of Finance in climate and public finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for marvelously keeping to the time constraint that I set on you. Kenneth.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. First, I want to say I'm very honored to be here, and maybe I'll present, and maybe I won't. Here we come. Okay. Very honored to have been invited to this talk and to be presenting this material in front of such an amazing audience. In the past 24 hours, I have learned so much about finance. My personal background is actually in climate science. I got my degree, I've been studying climate science for 25 years. The last 10 of years has been in doing climate resilience work in application. in development. So we led the ISET, led the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network engagement phase about 11 years ago. ISET-International, the organization that I work for, is a small NGO based out of the US, but we also have offices in Hanoi and in New Delhi. And you've heard from my colleague here, Shashi. So here's an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and the impacts and importance. Climate adaptation financing as a distinct challenge from mitigation financing. And this is because of the action scale at which these two different aspects operate. And then I'm going to talk about the challenge of climate justice and what the influence that has on climate adaptation financing, and the action scale. Where should action take place? Bottom up versus top-down processes. But first, because I'm a climate scientist, I'm going to go into a little bit of a climate lecture, so I should probably apologize ahead of time for taking too much time. So, as you know right now, there's actually, the COP24 is taking place in Poland. And I've been following that on the side, just seeing what's going on. And there was recently a quote that said, "Climate change is like a car zooming toward a cliff. Scientists are describing the technical issues about the car, but failing to warn the car is going to go off the cliff." Well, I have to say, as a climate scientist who's been working on this for 25 years, that I took a little, and I didn't give the author's name because I didn't want to pick on anyone in particular, but I felt a little surprised that that was the thought that people had about what climate scientists have been talking about in terms of climate change. I know that I know myself and many others have been talking about this issue, about the cliff, for 20 years now. So I just wanted to emphasize that point after reading this quote. I wanted to emphasize climate change a little bit more in my talk today. So climate change is an emergency for all sectors of society, period, or exclamation point, as the case may be. It's an emergency. Every sector is going to be touched by this issue. And I'm going to show a couple examples of what that might look like. So here are some potential climate change impacts. Floods, droughts, and storms we're pretty much aware of. Antibiotic resistance will get worse. Worker productivity will plummet. Agricultural productivity will go down. Air quality will get worse. These are all expected impacts from climate change, particularly here in Bihar. Without preparation, adaptation, climate change will reverse decades of growth and development globally, particularly in India. And I'll show you some examples of why. So first, I'm going to go a little bit back on these scenarios of, in this case, these are different climate models. This is actually quite an old projection, but the point isn't the projection itself, but to show how people usually think about climate change. People usually think about climate change as this slow process of getting warmer slowly over time. Depending on what you consider slow, but it's this regular process with a few ups and downs going over time. But evidence from ice cores shows something different. This is an example of the last climatic change on a global scale that happened just prior to the end of the Ice Age. This is the Ice Age leading into the end of the Ice Age, the Holocene as it's called. And that little bar that I've highlighted there shows the transition. So the depth there, the vertical axis is the number of years between now and the beginning of the current era, and the bottom, the number of thousands of years. And what you see along the bottom is a measurement of the delta O18 or the isotopes of oxygen. Really, it's a proxy for temperature. What Stevenson et al. Saw in that zoom in was that there were 3 fundamental climate shifts recorded in the ice core, and that these shifts happened in a non-linear fashion. They happened within 1 to 3 years. And so some of these shifts, particularly in the ice core, pick up different changes in things like the Asian monsoon. This is a map showing the global tipping points in the climate system. These are elements in the climate system that can create these sorts of shifts or are influenced by changes in the climate that can shift very quickly from one state to another. This is from Timothy Lenton, and this is from 2008 from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And I want to really point out, in this paper they talked a lot about Brazil and the North Atlantic deep water, which is up near Europe. So Brazil being forestry and the North Atlantic deep water being up near Europe, because a lot of the warmth of Europe depends on how that water is turning over and releasing heat into the atmosphere. And they're very concerned that that will stop happening and that Europe actually will get very much cooler in a warming climate. But what they didn't talk a lot about was the numbers of billions of people that are dependent on the Asian monsoon. And so I want to highlight that this is an important issue that we need to be aware of and think about and prepare for. So getting a little bit closer to home into more specific research on Eastern India that we've done. So in a previous project we were working on with the CDKN project out of Gorakhpur and in Vietnam as well, we looked at climate projections with the help of the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR. We looked at climate projections for Eastern India. And I'm going to talk a little bit about thresholds in this case. Here you see an example of temperature thresholds in terms of humans' physiological response to temperature. And this isn't just pure temperature, this is temperature and humidity. This is the combined effect. And what I've highlighted there is the considered threshold for beginning to, basically where people's productivity begins to get reduced, to the point where you move through the various stages to where it's dangerous to even be out. So what's actually very poorly studied is the physiological impact of heat on the body and how quickly you can recover from that. How many hours outside of such a heat situation does it take before your body is physiologically recovered? This is not really well understood because usually it's done in terms of 8-hour days, not in terms of long-term exposure. Here's an example. This one is particularly for Gorakhpur, but this is an example that we saw throughout Eastern India of how climate is changing. So what you see on the top graph there are the number of heat indice days above 37 degrees C. That's human body temperature. It's the number of days where this threshold is overcome. And on the bottom you see the number of days set on a scale from bottom to top. So the top one shows the time of year, the month, and the bottom shows the number of days. What is striking about this is that historically people have relied on their environment to cool themselves, usually at night. Usually after a few days break, when there's a few days of really high heat, there can be a couple of days break. And particularly at night, sleeping outdoors, recovering from impacts. And what our models project is that these days will disappear. And that's what that dark red area is, which starts in around the year 2022, that there will be this incessant heat that will last for weeks and months. And you can see, since that is a month time scale, that you can, by the 2050s, there's going to be at least 4 months when there's non-stop incessant heat in Eastern India. This is a map showing globally the population exposed to this incessant heat. And in the zooming in on the region, you can see that several states in India and Bangladesh are really where it stands out. So, jumping into climate finance, this is a climate finance talk. Jumping into climate finance, you can see that this is a spaghetti graph of sorts showing the different streams of climate finance. And what I really wanted to point out in this is that the vast majority of the funds go to mitigation, and of that, the vast majority goes to energy, renewable energy. Primarily, it's going to be solar power, wind power, and hydropower. The adaptation gets about 6% of the total funding. This is a graph showing the different mechanisms by which climate adaptation funding can be found on an international setting. So this is inclusive of the UNFCCC mechanisms as well as the non-UNFCCC mechanisms, primarily the World Bank. And it shows that there are a multitude of paths by which you can get that sort of funding. So each path will have its own requirements, will have its own needs to be justified. And so there's a bit of a mix of different ways to actually come about that funding. So I wanted to touch a little bit on why climate adaptation funding is so much different as well. One of the things that happened when they started bringing up the concept of climate adaptation and special funds for it is that there was a deep concern that what would happen with a requirement, with a request and requirement for further climate justice in terms of financing would be that that money would be taken out of development aid. They would just take development aid, put a box around part of it, and call that climate adaptation funding. And there was the idea behind that that was not right, because the climate is changing because of the amount of CO2 that's been released historically, and there is some need to pay reparations for that impact. So they worked very hard to make sure that the equation was development aid plus climate adaptation funding. The real challenge with that, though, was this, and the very difficult barriers there are to overcome in order to justify it as climate finance. So what's happened is that, and that's my time, I will wrap it up. What's happened is that climate finance, adaptation finance has become very challenging to get. There are many hurdles to jump because you need to justify the climate adaptation aspect of it, so it's not just seen as traditional development. A little bit on the action scale, this is the part of the challenge is that unlike mitigation, which is a global issue, I mean, the whole climate issue is built on sort of a global approach. Even CO2, which is a mitigation issue, even CO2 has it's a global impact. So if one country releases more, it has a global impact. Adaptation is a very different animal. Adaptation is a local issue. It'll be very different at the local scale. It will be sea level rise some places. It will be heat issues some places. It will be surprising things we don't even know yet in some places. And so the scale at which climate adaptation finance is needed is much more from the bottom up. It can be the state level, the provincial level. It can be the municipal level. It can even be the community and household level. And so the real challenge is how to, since these global scale, as we heard about, the hierarchical approaches are a real challenge for flexible, agile governance, how do we address some of these things? And I just came up with one example that we're working on right now at ISET, which is an effort to stop deforestation. So there's a lot of deforestation going on in Brazil right now, and it's not done by major firms, it's done by small holdings farmers. And it's very difficult for, to work with thousands and thousands of small holdings farmers to change their behavior. But one of the key value adds in keeping a sustainable forest is that it can add value to the end product. You can certify these things in a way where the end product, the consumers are willing to spend more on products that preserve forests. So we're looking to use blockchain technology to be able to track that, because with so many small-scale farmers, it's very challenging otherwise to do that. So that's one potential possibility. And so on that, I wanted to thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth MacClune. I now invite Purnamita Dasgupta.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you CEPF and ADRI for inviting me here. It's my first visit, and I'm really happy to be here. Much has already been said by my colleagues on the panel. I would essentially like to contextualize some ideas around financing the mainstreaming of climate change with you in the Indian context. As I thought of the topic that was given, one of the things that did come across to me was that we need to look at public finance as a mix of international flow of funds and domestic funds, to my reckoning. Because what has happened is that today we have this very hybrid set of fund flows, where it is very difficult to say that we should be looking at either one of the two. And I'm sure Abinash is also going to highlight some aspects of these in terms of when an individual state in the Indian economy or even the nation state in its entirety looks at what is available in terms of financing climate change. So what we have in the global scale is a hybrid set of ideas which have now sort of centered and crystallized around various mechanisms of financial flows that are intrinsically related with how effective negotiations on these are. And it is also good to recognize that what is not often sort of talked about is that the experience pre-Paris has been that a lot of the financial flows have come through private sector channels and have not been discussed much. This is now also on record. In a national or subnational context, two of the things that I think are very important in understanding financing for climate change is that for a typical developing context, what prioritizing climate finance means is that it calls for a change in the status quo on the distribution of funds from a given pot. So consequently, stakeholders, priorities all get differentially impacted, and this is a big issue. The second point that I would like to flag is that when we undertake any kind of climate-related action, whether it's an adaptation or mitigation, that action itself creates costs. It creates certain economic and social costs. You have gainers and losers. And again, in a developing economy context, this can be very important when we are doing decision-making on climate financing. So I'm trying to link it with the other sort of issues around this context. And then it becomes apparent that issues of scale, so we hear that climate change is going to be disruptive, but the actions that are needed to deal with climate change on either front are also going to be disruptive. So what happens is that the scale of funding that we are talking about becomes very important. The second thing that becomes very important is that what do we have on the table so far? Everybody is talking about Article 6 of the Paris Agreement now. We do not know as yet what rules will be finalized. And consequently, what will be the comfort levels between national and international ways of institutionalizing climate finance, tracking it, monitoring it, what will be required from our national level development planning in terms of tracking it, budgeting it, and putting in place certain monitoring systems. But for a minute, leaving all that aside, What's also important is how we go about designing our climate finance mechanisms. And with constantly changing rules of the game, it is very difficult for an individual nation or a state to concretize and say that this is the way it should be. What I'm talking about is that we need predictability in our systems, and that is still not there. Now, I know that we are running late, so in the interest of time, I'm going to just sort of come down to two specific examples, one in the arena of adaptation and one in the arena of mitigation, which has something to do with how we think about climate finance in our decision-making processes here. The first example I want to share with you is some evidence from a case study that was done here in the state of Bihar in West Champaran district. So this is the context of adaptation. So we're talking about what does adaptation financing mean. So this was an exercise to try and understand what is the cost effectiveness of going for a design for a toilet that takes climate change on board vis-a-vis one that doesn't. Okay, so that's putting it as simply as I can in the interests of time. So what was done was, basically, we know that this is a flood-prone area. So in this flood-prone area, under the current sort of emphasis on sanitation in various campaigns, and we know that the state has had its own campaigns earlier. Typically, a decision maker is faced with alternative designs, right? Now, the issue is that when we did this cost effectiveness analysis, one particular design scores way above the other designs. And it does so just when you take into account current climatic conditions. So this is not about climate change, it's not about how worse the flooding is going to get in the future. So you clearly have a situation where you do an economic analysis and you know that one design scores over the other. Now the question is, where do you get the finance for it? And what are the kinds of benefits and costs that you've looked at? So so when you look at this diagram, you can see that there are, on the left-hand side, what the 4 bars is showing are the various averted health costs and convenience costs. Now, these convenience costs are very interesting. It was an attempt to capture benefits that, convenience benefits that accrue to women when they have the access to toilets, particularly during floods. And here the design issues are very important, okay? So you can see that there are, and on the right-hand side, you have the rectangles depicting the benefits, the monetized benefits in terms of the alternative design with scores over the other. So the picture is very clear. You can see that, one definitely scores much higher than the other. We've tried to take gender aspects into account. You've done your homework. Now, the question that arises is that where would the finance come to, really be able to take the right decision here? So the scale, the design, all becomes very important. And this is where I think this conundrum between adaptation and development becomes very important in the framing of the SDGs. Obviously, it's a question of what you value. You value averting greater health costs. You value giving convenience benefits to women and children and the elderly. It's true that we want to do all these things, but when we put it in the context of the financial issues, would it be easy to finance this additionality that clearly is called for if you're thinking of greater flooding incidents in future. And it's not so easy to do. The second example I want to share with you in this context, it's not an example, it's actually some ideas I would like to discuss with you, is in the context of a mitigation issue. India has its nationally determined contributions that it has declared, the NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. One of these NDCs is to create a carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030 through trees and forest cover. Now, actually, this is quite a large commitment in terms of the, within what has been promised within the NDC. Now, we know that we have a finance commission that makes these inter-se allocation of grants across states through its horizontal devolution in two forms. It has one, the formula-based horizontal devolution that it does, and the other is grants, which are essentially, unlike the allocations under the formula, these grants are tied grants. The Finance Commission's terms of reference this time around specifically include the NDC. In the past few finance commissions have made allocations taking into account the importance of the forestry sector, either in terms of the fiscal disability and the limitations on the fiscal capacity of the state that it imposes, and also at times recognizing the importance of forests ecosystems. And the last Finance Commission, the 14th Finance Commission, made a devolution. It was an untied devolution by giving 7.5% weightage to dense forest cover in the formula. Why do I bring this up? I bring this up because now the big question is that if one is to motivate, one is to use a financial mechanism to motivate the creation of a carbon sink, to motivate mitigation activity. The question is how best to do it. And what now turns up very interestingly as we do stakeholder engagements is that up to the 13th Finance Commission, when it came as a tied grant, forest departments got the money. When it went in as part of the devolution through the 14th Finance Commission, forest department after forest department said that has been telling us that we didn't get any additional money from it, and this is not a route. And because obviously that was not part of the requirement, but this is not the route towards encouraging regeneration of forests or creating carbon sinks. So the important issue is how the design, I come back to how the design or the mechanism becomes relevant.
Purnamita.
Yeah, I'll just wind up. This is my last slide. So you will see that what happens is this, that depending on what definitions we take of forest cover, whether dense forest cover, whether recorded forest area, whether the green cover including trees outside forests, different states would gain or lose very differently depending on what definitions we take. And depending on whether you wish to reward new forest cover or whether you wish to award states for the fiscal disabilities that having large areas under forests impose, which would be this sort of a graph. And this would be the sort of graph that you would get if you would like to take into account what has happened in terms of increased forest cover over the last decade. And you can see there are states like Bihar and others which have gained a little bit, but A lot of those which are heavily forested states already do not have anything that they can much contribute in terms of an NDC target. So, so I would just like to wind up by going back to my initial thought that scale issues, design issues, and understanding that international flows are very important in the way that they impact our domestic flows has to be kept in mind. And this sort of and this hybrid matters a lot where an individual state is concerned as to what it will get in terms of climate finance, whether on adaptation or on mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Purnamita Dasgupta. Abinash Mohanty, please.
Sir? Huh. Out of 15 minutes, I'll use 10 minutes. One morning to all of you, and thank you, Chair and fellow panelists. Right away, I don't need to give you any brief introduction about what climate change is doing because Bihar is always witnessing it. All I would go directly is the work that we did for Bihar, basically carrying out the financial framework for making our budget climate-proofed. So these are some of the instruments that have been used, which have been already been discussed by my fellow panelists. So the conventional sources, as the question was asked, where is the money? So the money is primarily from the national budgets and international donors. Apart from that, MFIs and private sectors some way contribute more largely to the mitigation part. And if we talk of how do we assess the budgets or how do we tag our budgets, then it is basically in India, we follow a climate change system assessment framework, which is been framed by UNDP. And UNDP has been working more on CCFA framework, climate change financing frameworks. And this framework is on rapid clusterization. And this uses somewhere the cost-benefit analysis methodology to assess the government schemes and work more on it. And in Bihar, what we did is we found out the CCRS, which is the climate change relevance percentage, at the same time the climate change sensitivity, making the schemes understand how much sensitive are they to different kind of risk, and then linking it to the SDGs. So this is the first part of the Bihar SAFIN work that we did. Again, SAFIN is the State Action Plan on Climate Change Financial Framework. So what we did was we tried finding the coincidence with the State Action Plan on Climate Change. And to our surprise, Agriculture Department had no coincidence with the State Action Plan on Climate Change. This doesn't implicate that Agriculture Department doesn't have any budgets for climate resilience agriculture, but it is just that the documents do not have sync. Similarly, if we go down to looking at something around 632 activities were listed in the SAPCC, but out of which 27 coincided. I'll go further to state how the climate tagging was done. This is an example of the recent climate tagging exercise that we are performing at our center for the Water Resource Department and the targeted line departments. So the right part shows exactly the CCRS, which is the relevance part. I mean, how much relevant is in terms of making the, the scheme is delivering from a climate change point of view, and CCSS is the sensitivity part and how much it is. And to our surprise, Water Resource Department has got only 25% of its scheme climate sensitivity proved, which is relevant. But this is an comparison. I know this is a bit hazy in terms of looking at the comparison. This was a comparison based on the work that has been going on in climate finance across states and in some parts of Asia where Afghanistan, Pakistan and Nepal was also considered. To our surprise for Bihar, the best part of the story is that a lot has been invested on flood protection, but apart from that, none of the climate sensitivity part is taken care. So if you look at the adaptation gap, which is more importantly, Bihar is almost 50% adaptation-wise gap. We need 50% of our state budgets or somewhere some funds should flow in to make our budgets more climate-proofed. These are the SDG pointers, since there has been a lot of discussion on the SDGs. We thought of inculcating SDGs into the system and found out that these are the broad parameters how we consider SDGs, and climate action was always given a higher priority than other SDGs. So yes, this brings me to the first slide where I said that number of coinciding activities with the Agriculture Department and the SAPCC, or the State Action Plan on Climate Change. If you go down to the Bihar's agricultural roadmap, then we could find that impact of climate change agriculture, or the adaptation part, Bihar has already allocated 29,539.95 crores for coming 5 years. So it is just that the documents are in silos. The Environment Department doesn't consult with the Agriculture Department, or Agriculture doesn't consult with the Environment Department. If you go down to the department-wise breakout for 5 years, then these are the huge sum of money that is going to be invested in Bihar. So the scenario is not that bad. We don't have a resilient, climate-proofed budget or a work going on in climate change. It's just that the language of the problem is something different here in itself. So budgetary implications, of course, we need to have a cohesive action force in order to bring it more dynamic, and the documents need to be worked out. This is the matrix what Paul has already described about. This is a comparison. I would like to go through these slides. These are the comparison about the climate change adaptation projects that have been taking place in Bihar as well as in eastern part of India. So Bihar, we don't have any GCF fund so far. Of course, one of the concept notes have been approved, which is of 271 crores, and it is a grant-based concept note. But apart from that, we have a National Adaptation Fund, which is funded by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. We have a 23 crore project, which is again in sync with the Department of Agriculture. Coming down to Odisha, Odisha has a 20 crore NAF fund. Apart from that, Odisha is the first state in the country to have a green climate fund, which owes to something around 773.694. As far as West Bengal is concerned, adaptation fund, they have 23.12, because the range of adaptation fund mostly comes down to 40 crores. And then in Chhattisgarh, they have National Adaptation Fund of 21.47, Jharkhand has 24.73, Assam has 24.56 crores project. But the critical challenge lies here. Difference between good government and climate resilient development. This is nothing to do with the advocacy, but the part is that somewhere a little bit of tweaking need to be placed in terms of our planning. And then a lot of our panelists have been talking in the public finance sessions as well, top down to bottom up. We need to understand context-based planning for our districts, and even go down further micro to the block level to understand what are their sensitivity ratios. Then the lack of accountability. Today in India, we don't have accountability for any of our disasters or risks. It is just that the nature has done it, or it is our history which compels us to a 2-degree rise in the temperature. So that's all from my part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Abinash. We now welcome questions and comments from the floor. Ranjit, that's 1, 2, 3, okay, in the first round, and then we'll come back.
I have a question for Mr. Paul. When you said that household expenditure is the maximum, I could easily understand what Mr. Mohanty said, because it is the national budget financing and the international donor. That is my understanding. But you made a presentation, I know which country context, the household expenditure. Your examples, what you gave, farmer, seed, drought resilient seeds, I could understand. But I could not understand that how can household expenditure will be the maximum in private, public and government. This is one question I'm asking.
2 is somewhere here.
Thank you. My submission to all the panel is that when we discuss the climate finance, we only think about the expenditure side of the budget.
Yeah.
Mainly whether the expenditure is through for adaptation or mitigation kind of thing that we always think of, and how we could get the money to finance this adaptation and mitigation. But there is also a risk to our revenue side. And that kind of case studies haven't come out, and very largely. There are few case studies here and there. So the thing is that why the revenue risk is also involved in climate change. That is to be brought out somehow, and IIED is here, even other international agencies are there. Because unless there is a revenue risk, government always think this is a burden for them, because if they have to spend the money from the expenditure, because always comes the climate will be the last, because we have health problems, we have education problem, we have public infrastructure problem, we have several other mouths to feed. Then comes the climate change. So unless we say that your revenue is also in risks, unless you take care of your climate change problems, then I think it will take much time to address the climate change. Thank you.
You've addressed that to all four. You want to pin it down to anyone? No. All right, then any one of you is free to feel. All right, so there's one more.
My question is to Dr. MacClune. I'm Pranay from Takshashila Institution, Bangalore. My question is that what do you think about the potential of global climate change relocation insurance to address sudden large-scale waves of population displacement arising due to climate change-induced effects as a solution for climate change adaptation?
Go ahead. Once again, to all
Thank
four.
you. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not an authority on climate change, so I work in public health. My name's Kasturi Sen, based at Oxford and working in Patna with OPM. I just wanted to ask you, why are the poor people all over the world disproportionately being affected by climate change? One knows that it's precarious living conditions and working conditions, but perhaps some of your reflections on that would be helpful. And I also had this question on what kind of household level action were you describing? And it's come up earlier also. You know, people at the front line in the floodplains, for example, here, trying to undertake preventive action rather than mitigation and adaptation. And I just wondered whether you had also something to say, anybody across the board really, perhaps yourself especially, on prevention.
That's him. Paul Steele, okay. Okay, fine. I didn't see you. Sorry, Professor Govinda Rao. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify about the Finance Commission's giving 7.5% weight in tax devolution. This is not meant to be an incentive for forestry. That is never the case. We know that money will not go to forest department, and it is also not that, you see, the place where new forests have to come. You know, there is already a stock and there is a new thing that has to come. I mean, it was not designed for that purpose. Basic purpose is, when you have large forest area, it has a serious fiscal disability. You have revenue disability, you have cost disability in providing public services, and you have to spend more on, you know, on forest. For all these reasons, in fact, we considered that transfer is not meant to achieve 100 different objectives. Transfers are meant to offset the fiscal disabilities of the states, and that's precisely what has been done. And in fact, Javadekar once asked me, when he was the forest minister, how do I get that money? I said, you don't get it. I mean, in fact, you see, everybody wants to control the money. Now, if you want to design a transfer system to this thing, as I said, it's not, transfer is not meant for that, but if you want to do it, then you can give weight and then say that this portion of that money can go to a particular department, forest department. That can be done, but, you know, I mean, I would not dilute the role of the transfer system.
Some questions were addressed to everybody. So Purnamita, you want to start? You want to respond, or because some were addressed to, or go ahead.
Should I use this? Okay. I think thank you for that point, Professor Rao. I completely sort of empathize with that, and thank you for it. In terms of this question from Dr. Sen on, I would like to say that, it's partly climate science-based evidence that the poor and the poor, as it seems, but the poor nomenclature also come partly because there is an overlap. Sometimes the poor or the disadvantaged are the ones who have settled also on the most marginal lands or the most, so for instance, consider arid, semi-arid areas vis-a-vis deltas, for instance. So there is a certain logic to that as well. So you are sometimes that is one aspect where, for the geography or the terrain makes you vulnerable. And there's the other aspect also where actually, the way in which economists at least think about it is in terms of seeing climate change as a stressor that adds to a multi-stressor situation that already exists. That is why you repeatedly, to my mind, you come up with the poor and disadvantaged terminology in this climate literature.
No, I don't want
Thank
to
you.
engage with you, but then basically when I say fiscal disparity, the states have revenue capacity, states have expenditure needs. In fact, the states with low revenue capacity should be allowed to have higher higher expenditure needs have to be, or cost disabilities will have to be taken care of. With the objective of the whole transfer system, if you see both theory and the way it is done in many countries, is to enable the states to provide comparable levels of public services, not a particular service. Enable, not enforce. Enable the state to raise the level of public services at a particular tax effort. So it's not meant for this particular purpose or that particular purpose. That is general purpose. Now you can have any number of centrally sponsored schemes and then specific purpose transfers coming from that. That's a different issue.
Thank you for the questions. I'll just start on this question about why are poor people disproportionately affected. I think there are three factors. The first of all is health. The health of the poor is linked to climate change, as we heard from Ken about heat stressors and exposure to malaria and so on, linked to climate change vectors. Then livelihoods, the impact on access to their livelihoods like water and so on. And then finally vulnerability, all the links to disasters and so on. So I think health, livelihoods and vulnerability are why the poor people, particularly women, are especially exposed to climate change. The second question about why are household expenditures at their maximum? I don't think they should be, and this is based on a hypothesis, but despite all the discussion about international finance, I think if you actually look at my hypothesis is you look at the data, most of the money actually being spent on climate change is by poor people doing what is called autonomous adaptation, actually spending their own money adapting to climate change, not money that they're receiving from the international community. That should hopefully change, but in the short run, that's the unfortunate reality. And then finally, this interesting point about the revenue side and needing to make the link with revenues. I think that's a very good point. And one link is that if there are increased disasters from climate change, the revenues of the government will go down because they'll keep having to spend on disaster, post-disaster cleanup and post-disaster management. So I think there is a link with revenues as well. Thank you.
So on the question about why the poor, I'll also I was thinking about that as well. But I think it's very much like disasters. The poor are often hit hardest in disasters. But in terms of climate change, it's also the general reliance, greater reliance on natural capital, thinking about it in terms of capitals, for livelihoods and for general, even for transport or other needs. And the basically better access to other, primarily financial capital that other people have. In terms of insurance, actually, there's some really good examples of insurance being used for climate adaptation. There's some work being done, I've forgotten who, in the Philippines right now, where they're working on insurance products where, since attribution of events is improving, the ability to attribute climate change to impacts on a certain event, like a hurricane in the US, that capacity is improving. With that capacity comes the possibility of insurance products that are based on attribution. That said, the real challenge in many locations is uptake. People generally don't buy insurance and don't trust it to pay out when they need it to. Yeah.
I'll just add with some data to what Paul said about the risk of investment. The Economic Survey of India in 2016-17 stated that 7,000 crores of loss has already been incurred by Indian states because of disasters. So this is one of the entry points. And just to conclude this statement, the way forward for financial institution is to recognize the risk of the climate change and hence to change the climate of India's financial sector. That's it.
Thank you. Then all that remains for me is to thank the panelists and thank you all for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you all for an interesting discussion. I request Dr. Sunita Lal to kindly present the mementos. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Correa, for chairing this session. Thank you.